Now, the state assembly has allowed an impeachment investigation into Governor Cuomo to proceed. We want to bring in now Christopher Bobst, a constitutional expert there on New York's Constitution, co-author of the New York Constitution, a reference guide. Sir, thank you for being with us. We appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
We understand that the only thing that has happened so far is that a committee has been authorized, of course, to open a probe. So that's kind of a top of the first inning like move, correct? That's where we are as of tonight.
That is correct. That's what's been authorized. An investigation is going to be conducted, and then ultimately the Senate may vote on an impeachment resolution. And if it does, that'll come at the conclusion of the investigation.
And this is a very rare thing we're witnessing if things do progress. Of the 56 governors in New York, only one has actually been removed from office by a vote like this, and that was back in 1913, so definitely rare. What would be the next step if things do indeed proceed? Walk us through the basic mechanics, especially for a country that has witnessed two federal impeachment, presidential impeachment trials in the last 2 years.
Sure. I could kind of tell you how it differs and how it's similar. So you would have the impeachment by the Assembly. There are 150 members in the New York State Assembly, and the Constitution of the state requires that there be a majority of the elected membership of the Assembly. So that would mean 76 Assembly members would need to vote to impeach. And that's regardless of how many ultimately vote. If there are 4 members missing because of illness or otherwise indisposed, you still need 76 members. At that point, you would have a trial, much like you did at the federal level. Now, in this case, though, instead of just the state Senate, there's what's called the Court for the Trial of Impeachments, which would be the state Senate, as well as the 7 judges of the New York Court of Appeals, which is the state's highest court. In addition, Andrea Stewart Cousins, the Senate Majority Leader, who's also the temporary president of the Senate, under the rules of the state constitution, is not allowed to participate in the trial. So you would have 62 state senators, 7 members of the Court of Appeals. They would constitute the court for the trial of impeachments. And if 2/3 of the members voting at the conclusion of the trial vote to convict, then the governor could be removed from office, and they could also vote whether to bar him from holding future office in the state.
And again, it becomes a numbers game, much like any political process where the votes are. There are some reports tonight suggest that the votes are there or are very close to being there, that if they do proceed down this road, they would have the votes. But that is obviously for a later time. Just to step back from the process for a second, it is very rare, as we've seen before, for a politician to ever want, if he thinks the numbers are against him or her, to stay long enough for that vote to happen, to be convicted. Basically a Nixon situation where they went to the Oval Office and said, hey, we have the votes. You may want to leave, and he did. So if the numbers really do seem like they're going toward impeachment and removal, it would seem likely that Mr. Cuomo would step down rather than suffer the embarrassment of a formal removal.
Well, tough to gauge what this particular governor is going to do. Historically, you are correct. Most governors and other leaders who have been confronted with the imminent possibility of impeachment and removal from office. And what makes this a little different is in most impeachments, it's the party that's bringing the impeachment proceeding is not the same as the political party of that individual being impeached. In this case, you have the democratically controlled Senate and Senate and Assembly of the New York State Legislature and a Democratic president. And you also have a president who has somewhat of a different legacy in the fact that, a governor who has a somewhat different legacy in the fact that his father was a 3-term governor of the state who served with much distinction. So I can't necessarily determine how that would weigh into his calculus, but it's probably there somehow as well. If it appears obvious that he's going to be removed, if enough of the members of his own party make it clear to him that there are the votes to impeach, there are the votes in the Senate to remove him from office, it would seem unlikely that he would go through the process that would harm both the party and his legacy by going through an impeachment. But at the same time, you can't really handicap what he's going to do.
And Christopher, real quick, a few seconds left. Just remind folks, because the governor hinted today there's politics behind this. Just remind people who the lieutenant governor is of New York State and what her role would be during an impeachment, and if Cuomo would be removed or just resigns.
Sure. She would be she is Kathy Hochul, who's also a Democrat in New York. The lieutenant governor and the governor run on a ticket, unlike some states where the governor and lieutenant governor are elected separately and you could have different parties. Here in New York, the governor and lieutenant governor run on a ticket. So this would be another Democrat who would take his place if he were removed from office or if he were to resign. And once he's impeached by the assembly under the state constitution, Kathy Hochul, as the lieutenant governor, would then become the acting governor until the impeachment proceedings concluded. The other thing that's of some interest is if ultimately she were to become the governor, either by resignation or removal from office through the impeachment conviction process, she then, under New York law, existing case law, would be able to name her own lieutenant governor without any confirmation by the state legislature.
Interesting. We'll see where it all goes. Interesting times in New York State. Certainly another political drama the country's watching. Christopher, thank you so much for your time and expertise.
Yeah, you're very welcome.